right, we will go ahead and get started. Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see my slide deck? Great, thank you so much. So thank you everyone for joining us for the fourth in a series of webinars focused on using the voluntary framework of accountability. I am joined by my lovely colleagues from the Center for Student Success who are helping out today, monitoring the chat and letting me know if we have any questions from folks as well. So we have a small group today, so please feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself if you have any questions. We had a few more people registered, but I think today's very nice weather probably, I bet there's some people who cut out early and are taking a nice walk outside, which I hope to be doing very soon. But let's go ahead and get started, because I know all of you came to talk about VFA data today. So like I said, this is a webinar series that we came up with this summer. For those of you who have been attending a lot of events at the center and are involved in a lot of our work, you know that we really weren't doing anything else over the last month or so. So we said, heck, why don't we do a whole 5-part webinar series about the VFA? But I'm glad we did, because we've gotten a lot of really positive feedback from people and generated some good ideas about how people can use these data more strategically at their institutions. Today we focus on transfer, but we had already had 3 other webinars. We provided an overview of the VFA. We did a session focused on DevEd, a session focused on economic stability and equity. And then in November, we'll do a kind of a cleanup session, if you will, focused on student success. So we'll focus on a few different areas of the VFA in that webinar. And today we're talking about transfer. So the reason that we wanted to have this webinar series is because most community colleges in Michigan report data to the VFA. But we really think that too few people have access to it and are really using it to its full advantage. So we wanted to help people understand how to read the VFA reports, and then also to increase access to and use of those reports. Another thing that we really like about the VFA is the ability to pretty easily benchmark with peer institutions. And so today we'll be talking about Michigan data, but all of you should be able to go back to your IR offices and request data for your own institution, which gives you the chance of comparing your data to Michigan data. We think that that's very helpful, because seeing a number with no context doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so being able to benchmark with other institutions kind of lends itself to a little bit more a better understanding of the data and really what you're looking at. And then finally, what we wanted to do is make this easier for you to use. And so we are sharing a customizable template where you can present your college data. So on the MCCA website, you can find these slides in a PDF, and then you can also find a PowerPoint that says editable at the end. Feel free to take that slide deck, download it, present it if you would like just to present Michigan data, or I would also encourage you to add rows in of your own institution's data so you can do some of those peer comparisons, but present data to stakeholders at your own institution as well. So we're trying to make it a little bit easier for you to share this information with your peers. These are terrific resources if you are an administrator and you have the opportunity to present in a faculty meeting. If you are a faculty member and you have an opportunity to present with your peers, these slides we are hoping can be very helpful for you to just kind of easily plug and play. Please change them if there are things that you do or don't like about the slides. Totally fine with us, but we wanted to give you a template that would make that easier for you. So today, in terms of engagement, if you've been on a center webinar, you've seen this slide. Please rename yourself to include the name of your college so we all know where you're from. If you're like me, I just went into my Zoom account and just permanently changed my name to Erica Oriens MCCA because we ask people every time to change their name to their institution. So I just went in and changed it permanently. So. And then please use the chat. Katie added some information in the chat, and I'm so happy that Kathy said that she has used one of our templates already to present the DevEd data, and it worked very well. Yay, yay. There's a purpose for all of our work. So please use your chat and then raise your hand to speak. You should be able to unmute yourself, but if you cannot, let us know and we can unmute you. But we want to be able for people to be able to ask questions as well. Okay, I'm not going to go through these slides in too much detail because I recognize pretty much every name on this list. And so you probably know who we are at the Center for Student Success and what we do. You probably know that this is a sampling of some of our current initiatives. And we enjoy two things, the colors green and blue, and we also enjoy using my in front of everything we do. So we have a lot of initiatives going on related to transfer and DevEd and economic stability and math and guided pathways, and you see VFA on there as well. So this just gives you a sampling of what we have going on now. We're part of the National Degrees When Due initiative, but we almost didn't do it because their colors are red and black, and you know, like I said, we like the green and blue, but that's okay. Oops. You also probably know my fantastic colleagues, Precious, Jenny, and Katie, who are joining me here today as well, who lead the vast majority of the work that we do at the Center for Student Success and do an excellent job doing that. So I thank them for being with us here today and appreciate all their help as we've been doing these workshops as well. They have served as sort of subject matter experts on a lot of these topics, and Katie will be helping out with that today as well. Katie put a link in the chat already to the MCCA website. I would encourage you to go out there. If you look on the events page, you can filter by the Center for Student Success, and you can register for any of our upcoming events. If you click on an event, there should be a registration link in there, and there should be a description as well that you can see if that's appropriate for you. Because all of our events are virtual for the foreseeable future, some may or may not be more appropriate for you, but all are welcome to the work that we do. Okay, so let's get into the VFA. Some of you have been on our other webinars, and so this first part here is very similar to what we've shared before, but then we'll get into the data on transfer. So first I want to talk about what the VFA is. The Voluntary Framework of Accountability was created by the American Association of Community Colleges, and it was created several years ago. I think the first community colleges in Michigan participated in about 2013. And for those of you who remember way back then, the dominant measure of student success was the what we typically called the IPEDS graduation rate, or the student right to know graduation rate, which essentially tracked full-time students, first-time full-time students who graduated from the same institution where they initially enrolled. And it wasn't a very effective tool to measure the work that we were doing at community colleges. And so VFA developed the Voluntary Framework of Accountability, and it tracks the outcomes of both full and part-time students. It tracks students' outcomes for 6 years instead of the 3 years that the feds were following. And it looks at, tracks a menu of several different outcomes. So getting a degree from the first institution at which you were enrolled, we know is actually not the experience for the vast majority of students, well, over 50% of students. And so it measures those outcomes, a different set of outcomes as well. In more recent years, the VFA has added shorter term outcomes as well that have been very helpful for some of our work. So what are those 6-year VFA metrics? So after 6 years, the VFA looks at several different metrics. One, they look at degree completion. So both bachelor's degrees at the community college, so this isn't at the universities, but bachelor's degrees at the community college, associate degrees. And then they also look at if the student did or didn't transfer after they received the associate degree. They look at certificate completion and the transfer of students after they earn their certificate. They look at students who have transferred to another institution, students who are still enrolled during that 6th academic year that we were tracking students. And then they also identify the number of students who left having earned greater than or equal to 30 credit hours or left earning less than 30 credit hours. So those are the 6-year outcomes that they track. They also track, as I mentioned, the last few years have started tracking VFA metrics after 1 year. And this work really came about based on some of the work that was happening in guided pathways. AACC had their guided pathways colleges, and the Community College Research Center was doing a lot of research on those guided pathways colleges. And they and all of us were really saying, gosh, 6 years is a long time to wait to see how well we're doing in terms of student success. What would be some early metrics to help us, to guide us and help us understand if students are making progress? And so the VFA stepped in and started tracking metrics after the first year. And they track metrics in 3 different categories. One is credit accumulation after the first term and credit accumulation after the first year. And then they track gateway course completion. So this would be a completion of a college level English and math courses. And then they also track fall to next term retention, and they also track the credit success rate. So they're looking at some of those shorter term outcomes in the first year. These are quite good indicators of how well students will do later, and surprise, no surprise later, we're going to be looking at how some of these metrics predict student success later on. The other fantastic thing about the VFA is it disaggregates data by subgroup, and it specifically looks at the 6 subgroups that we're sharing here. And some of them we see in many data reporting in other areas where we report data. So we often look at gender. We often look at Pell status. We have sometimes looked at enrollment status, but mostly we've just looked at full-time students and not part-time students at all. And we frequently disaggregate data by race and ethnicity. We do not frequently disaggregate data by students who were or were not college ready. And it's difficult for us to find outcomes based on age. And part of the reason I mention that, and that age often becomes top of mind, because we will be welcoming many students to our campuses in Michigan starting in January, who will be joining us because they will be funded through the Futures for Frontliners program, or they will be funded through the Michigan Reconnect grant. The Michigan Reconnect grant is a free community college program for adults who are 25 and older who do not have an associate degree or higher. And we understand that among all of the about 60,000 applicants in the Futures for Frontliners program, about 2/3 of those students are age 25 and older. So we will be seeing almost certainly an increase in the number of adult students on our campus, age 25 and older, in the next couple of semesters. So that's the data that's available from the VFA.
Hey, Erica.
Yes.
A great question in the chat about fall-to-fall retention. And it looks to me like there are some retention statistics tracked. I'm in the data manual on the VFA website, but maybe you know more specifically whether that's something that is
I can look into it, but I could check. I don't think they do fall to fall, but let me think about this, because I think there's a way to derive that from some of the other areas of the VFA. So okay. I can look into that.
Thanks.
So what are we going to look at today? So, you know, the last 3 slides that I had, you can imagine what the Excel files look like when we're looking at all of those outcomes disaggregated for multiple years of students. It's a lot of data, it's a lot of numbers, it's very straining on your eyes. And so one thing we've been doing is really kind of narrowing this down to metrics that we feel like are relevant to the topic we're talking about. So today, what we're going to talk about are 3 areas. We're going to look at students who transferred after they received an associate degree. We're going to look at students who transferred to another institution. They didn't earn an award of any kind. And we're going to look at students who left after they earned less than 30 credit hours. So you may say, Erica, why are we looking at students who left after they earned 30 credit hours? And you'll kind of see that story evolve as we look through the data. But sometimes these numbers can be a bit abstract in the sense that, like, well, how many students should really transfer after they earn their associate degree? And like, how many students is the right number of students who should transfer? And so we pull that data in on students who left with fewer than 30 credits to give some context to the other data that we're looking at. So just kind of keep that in mind as we walk through this as well. We are also going to look at data by a lot of different subgroups as well. So look forward to that when we get a little bit later in the presentation. I went through this already, but I wanted you to have the definitions that VFA publishes about each of these metrics. So the transfer after the receipt of the degree is that a student earned a degree and then enrolled in another post-secondary institution after their last enrollment at your institution. Transferring to another institution would be those students who enrolled at your institution. We're going to be looking at students who enrolled in fall of 2013. After they stopped enrolling at your institution, they enrolled in another institution of higher education. And then we will look at students who left with less than 30 credits. And so what that means is students who were enrolled at your institution in the fall of 2013, and between then and the fall of 2019, to the best of our knowledge, they have not enrolled anywhere else. So those are the 3 definitions of students we will be looking at. So let's get into it and let's start looking at some of the data. So we are going to first just look at what are our outcomes. And I have a couple of poll questions that I want you to answer. And the very first one is, what percentage of students transfer after they receive an associate degree from our institution? Remember, these students started in the fall of 2013, and they would have needed to earn the associate degree and transfer within 6 years. So between then and the fall of 2019. I see we have about 10 people who have voted. And so as you can see, I'm killing time here while everybody votes. So I'm going to end the polling and reveal the results to you. And it looks like about over half of us thought that less than 25% transferred after earning an associate degree. And then we've got 25 to 50% and more than 50%. So I'm going to ask you to answer one more question. And this question is, within 6 years of enrollment, what percentage of students transferred? So they didn't earn a degree at our institutions, but they transferred someplace else. So while you're thinking about that, I will kill time a little bit for a few more seconds while you answer that question, and then we will end the poll and look at our results. So I am going to end the poll, and it looks like about, what is that, 2/3? I have no idea how we have 67 and 25%, but we do. Between 25 and 50% was the most popular answer that we had. Oop, I'm not sharing my results. So now I am sharing my results. And you can see that I don't understand how the math is working there, but that's okay. Okay, so
Erica,
let's
it's
see.
all the non-voters, which is an important message as we head into election season.
That's true, it is. It is an important message for everyone to vote. Everyone has their right to vote. Okay, so let's see the answers. Okay, so I'm showing you the outcomes for all of our categories in this slide, because again, this context is pretty important. So these are our outcomes for students in the main cohort. In the fall of 2013, 48,444 students started at one of the community colleges in Michigan. And that means they started for the first time at your institution. They may have attended a previous institution before, but for the first time they started at your institution. And what I've done here is presented to you our outcomes, but then I also clustered those together in the combined column down here. And you can see that about 20% of our students earned a certificate or an associate degree. About 30% of students transferred, and almost half of students left. They never showed up anywhere else. They left with credits, anywhere between probably 0 and who knows how many credits, but they left with credits and they didn't earn a credential. My numbers didn't, because of rounding, my numbers didn't go up to 100%, but it was 100.9, so I got pretty close. So, oops. So let's look at the 3 categories that we really wanted to focus on today. And so I gave you a preview of this, but only 8% of our students transferred after an associate degree. So we don't see a whole lot of students who get an associate degree and then transfer after that. However, we do see another 28.8% of students who transferred with an award, but compare that to 37% of students who left with less than 30 credits. So as you saw on the previous slide, the largest percentage of our students in terms of these outcomes that we measure, the largest, the greatest percentage of those students left with less than 30 credit hours. And you can see perhaps why I thought that was important to add that as part of our conversation here. Chelsea asked a good question in the chat about the Michigan Transfer Agreement. Chelsea, at most institutions in Michigan, the MTA is not a certificate program. Part of that is because around the same time that the MTA was being implemented, there was a federal policy that was implemented that required institutions to demonstrate that their students were gainfully employed. It was called gainful employment, or GE. So that it was a policy that required us with those certificate programs to ensure that students were gainfully employed. So that makes it hard to make the MTA a certificate program because, of course, it's unlikely that they would be gainfully employed. Now that federal policy has been repealed, and there are more institutions who are offering a certificate program, an IPEDS recognized certificate program that is the MTA. It's essentially 30 credit hours of the MTA. Now, remember that these students started in fall of 2013, so it'll be interesting when we see our data moving forward if we see the percentage of those students that earn a certificate and transfer increasing. I think that's a really good metric to follow as well. All right.
Yeah.
So,
oh, sorry, I was going to ask a question. I didn't want to type it because I was a little confused.
Yeah, go ahead.
So can you go back a slide if you don't mind?
Yes.
So when I'm looking at the transfer after associate's degree, does it mean any associate's degree at the college, or can it, or so for example, we have associate's degrees in welding that are really not designed to transfer. So are those students counted in that for that number? So it kind of is deceiving a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yes, that is exactly right. It is any associate degree. It's any associate degree. And one of the pros and cons of the VFA in many ways is that it counts all students. It doesn't say these students get counted and these students don't, you know, in these outcomes. So you're absolutely right that it includes all associate degrees, and we don't have a way of measuring intent. And that's why I also include this kind of left with less than 30 credit hours, because I think it gives some context to that 8% number as well. Oops.
Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, thank you very much.
Great. So let's look at where we see some equity gaps. And I am going to launch another poll. And for those of you who have attended some of our other calls, you'll see we have some different data here when it comes to looking at the equity gap. So you can choose as many of these as you would like, but among what subgroups do you think we have equity gaps? So we will look at race, ethnicity, we'll look at Pell status, we'll look at age and college readiness, and I think there's actually one more that I don't know why it's not showing up on our poll here. But I'll give you another couple seconds to respond to the poll, and then we'll share our poll results. I appreciate you all working in these polls. I think it kind of helps us give some context to this. I did forget to say in our last slide, I think our respondents who the majority of our respondents got those questions right in our last poll. So I'm sharing the results here, and 100% of participants thought that we had equity gaps in race and ethnicity, about 80% Pell status, about most people believe so in age, and almost everybody in college readiness as well. So let's take a look. Okay, so now we're looking at the same cohort of students we were looking at before. And the first row here is the exact same data that we were looking at. So this is all students. And then the VFA uses the federally defined race ethnicity categories. And you can see here that we report the number of students that are in that category, and we report the outcomes of those students across each of the 3 areas that we're looking at here. I want to pause there, and I want to see, Katie, any observations that you might have about the data that we're looking at here?
Yeah, so I think the point that you made earlier about the difficulty in measuring intent is important, or aspiration. Some of you know that I'm in the midst of writing a dissertation about transfer, and most of the literature will guesstimate around 80% of students who enter the community college have aspiration of transferring into a baccalaureate program. And certainly when you start to compare that to the transfer out rates, you see big disparities if that is a true number. However, we don't see a lot of difference in the transfer out rates by some of these equity cohorts, which is really interesting. I'm not necessarily surprised by that. I think other people might be surprised by that because we're used to seeing gaps related to particularly race and ethnicity. But I think it would be, I think this data only tells part of the story. I think it would be really interesting to be able to look closer at what these students are taking or what kind of credits are or are not transferring with them and what impact that might have on their completion rates as they get further into their program. Some of you know that I'm obsessed with course articulations, and I really think that transfer out rates, even transfer with award rates are not telling us what's really happening with these students and where we're losing them in the pipeline. And I believe that the transfer of their credits and the courses that they're taking have a lot to do with that. Interestingly, sorry, go ahead, Jenny.
Oh, I was just going to say, I can't remember if you said, is this all transfer, any transfer, or is it only vertical transfer from a 2-year to a 4-year?
It is to a 2-year or a 4-year institution.
So you can't, so it does count community college to community college transfer.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
And some of you are familiar with the NSC data that we had been using to kind of frame the My Transfer project. And I'm going to drop a couple links in here in just a moment because I actually went down a little rabbit hole because they just released updated tables for 2020 for their tracking transfer report. And the good news is that all of the numbers are on the uptick with the tracking transfer report in the latest 2020 update. And again, I'll share links so you guys can look at that. The bad news is there are still equity gaps in completions, particularly for underserved students, those who come from racially minoritized communities, and certainly for low-income students. So there are still some gaps there. I don't know that this data that we're looking at here through VFA is really illuminating that for us, but these students are all transferring at around similar rates. So I think that that's good. There aren't necessarily barriers to access, but I think we need to look a little deeper if we're really going to be able to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Katie. And I think we see here focusing a little bit more on the students who have left with less than 30 credits. We do see some pretty significant equity gaps here, particularly among American Indian and Alaska Native students and Black students, where about half of Black students are leaving with less than 30 credit hours. So if we kind of put these in big round numbers, I think that's just really something that I think is important to look at a little bit more when you're looking at your own data on your campus. So the next area we wanted to focus on is Pell status. And so we see here that among the 48,000 students in our cohort, about 26,000 of those students were awarded the Pell Grant and 21,000 students were not awarded a Pell Grant. Again, we see some equity gaps here. Fewer students transfer after they earn an associate degree. Fewer students who are awarded Pell transfer with no award, and more students leave with less than 30 credit hours. So, but where we really see the biggest gaps are among those students who leave with less than 30 credit hours. So I think that's a really important takeaway. The other thing that I think is important, and we all know this, but I find it very helpful to see these numbers of how many of our students receive a Pell Grant. And I think that's even just the size of the cohort, I think is very helpful when we're looking at this Pell data as well. If we look at outcomes by age, and in our poll, I think we had fewer people who thought that we would see equity gaps by age. Once again, what the VFA does is it looks at the age categories. I think these are the same age categories as iPads. Thinking back to talking about those futures for frontliner students and the Reconnect students, for a pretty long time, well, really kind of post-recession in community colleges, we are increasingly serving more traditional age students. And you see that in our data reflected here. Over half of our students are under the age of 20. We see that they are also more likely to transfer with an associate degree, to transfer with no award, and they're less likely to leave with less than 30 credit hours. But the other observation that we make here is we see a significant drop off in those students who transfer with an associate degree, and then that declines pretty significantly the older students get. That's, I think Chelsea maybe asked the question earlier, it could be because those older students, the students who are over the age of 20 when they begin, are pursuing programs that are not intended for students to transfer and earn a bachelor's degree. They're planning to go right into the workforce. And I think the data here would bear that out because they're not transferring after they earn the associate degree. Interestingly, among students who started when they were between 20 and 24, we see a slight uptick in the students who transfer with no award. And I wonder if there's something going on there of students who have reverse transferred and then are going back to the university, not in the credit reverse transfer, but they started at a university under the age of 20 and then came to us when they were 20 or older. And so we see a kind of an uptick there, but then we see a similar trend in age as we progress, that fewer students transfer the older they are. And then we also see even more students who left with less than 30 credit hours. The older that students get, the more likely they are to leave with less than 30 credit hours, all the way up to students who are 50 or older. 60% of those students leave with less than 30 credit hours. So I also want to point out here some work that we did. This brings up, it reminds me of a report that we did, I think in 2016 with Peter Barr, who's a faculty member at the University of Michigan. And Dr. Barr looked at what he described as skills builders in community colleges. Those are people who enrolled in a community college, took a concentration of credits, passed those courses, did quite well in those courses, and then left without earning a credential. And he looked at their labor market outcomes after they left. Because perhaps those students, we talk about those students a lot that just came to community colleges to get skills, and then they were going to go back into the workforce. What he found is about 7% of students, of all of our students, so essentially 7% of that 48,000 students, are skills builders. So they're what I just described as those students who I learned the skill that I wanted. I didn't ever wanted a degree to begin with, but even though, to get financial aid, you kind of have to say you want a degree. About 7% of our overall student population, but closer to 25% of our students who are exclusively enrolled in CTE programs. So in some of these numbers, you could probably extrapolate a little bit that you could kind of bump these numbers down, if you will, because we could account for example, instead of 37% of our students with less than 30 credit hours, it might be more like 30% of our students. I will say, for those of you who are on the phone who maybe work in those occupational programs, I think some of that research that Dr. Barr did also demonstrates where there could be a huge opportunity here to develop certificate programs that would meet the needs of those skills builders. So they actually do leave with a credential or a certificate from a community college. So that's, I think, something that's important to think about when we're looking at these students who left with less than 30 credit hours. And as you know, our MCCA's national organization is the American Association of Community Colleges, and they've been pushing for Pell, the Pell Grant, to cover those short-term programs. And I think just today they released a new brief on why they think that would be so valuable to their members, but also to the communities their members serve as well. Let's look at college readiness. And when we look at the VFA, what we mean by college ready is that in English, mathematics, and reading, the student was college ready. And in English, mathematics, or reading, the student was not college ready. It's a binary determination of college readiness. And probably as expected, we see that students who are college ready were more likely to transfer after an associate degree. They were also more likely to transfer, and they were less likely to leave with less than 30 credit hours. So college readiness is important, and it's, I think, an important metric to look at as you're thinking about your disaggregated data. I'm going to pause here, Katie, and see if there's any other observations that you wanted to make before we start looking at credit accumulation.
Sorry, I went down a rabbit hole again. No, I think it's this idea of what's happening with their course, the students' course taking, and whether or not that impacts their transfer trajectory or even what their aspirations are. So I'm sensitive to Clarence's note in the comments about these skill builder students, or Erica and I also had a conversation about a student like myself who entered directly into a four-year institution, but I was a self-paying undergrad and I took strategic transfer classes every summer at our local community college. And I don't know what impact that has on these kinds of data disaggregations, because those students would not typically be included as a student that starts at that community college, but certainly for me, that transfer was very important to my completion of a baccalaureate degree, and it probably gets missed somewhere along the way in counting these cohorts. Just like those students who are these skills builders that Clarence noted and that Erica was discussing with regard to our report with Dr. Barr, we don't know. They may have aspiration to transfer, but we don't really know that, and we don't track that at intake. So transfer data is tricky all around, but that doesn't mean that we need to stop looking at it and trying to analyze it, particularly from equity perspectives.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, I mean, Clarence, I know Mott has been a leader in a lot of the non-credit adult education, skills builder training kind of things. And I don't think we want to minimize the value of that. And I think that's why AACC is so focused on getting those programs to be Pell eligible, particularly because of the new Futures for Frontliners programs and the Reconnect programs. It'd be great for those students to do those at no charge. So I really hope that happens, and I think we'll be able to reflect that in the data that we track as well.
And Erica, just also related to that, I think Michigan's not the only state that's looking at these kinds of policy initiatives, because we all know that the workforce is changing, and even more so now because of the pandemic. And that also means that some of those CTE areas will become transfer areas probably in the next decade or so or less.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I mean, it's already happening locally, but I think we're going to see it happening at scale.
Good. So I want to transition a little bit to credit hours. And you may remember that I mentioned earlier, we had our VFA subgroups, which are typically demographics that we're looking at. But the other cool thing that VFA did more recently is they're looking at the long-term outcomes, but they're looking at those one-year outcomes and saying, okay, so we have these, we know what happens in the first year. How helpful are those to understand what students' longer term outcomes might be? So for me, this stuff gets super interesting because you know what's going on with your students in the first year. So I think that can be really helpful. Okay, so let's look at our 3 outcomes among students who earned 6 or more credits in the first year. Again, this metric became super important to me more recently because all of those Futures for Frontliners students and all of those Reconnect students are required to enroll in 6 credit hours to be eligible for the scholarship. And we know that that's to be eligible for Pell as well. But this became really important to me because I wonder if we're going to have a lot more students that just enroll in 6 credit hours. So the students we're looking at here earned 6 or more credits in the first term, and they achieved that, so they did or they did not earn 6 or more credits in the first term. And super interesting that it's split basically half and half. Okay, so 25,000 students did not earn 6 credits in the first term, 22,000 did. Among the students who did meet those 6 credit hours, 14% of those students earned their, transferred after they earned their associate degree, and only 2.6% of the students who did not earn 6 credits in the first term transferred after they earned their associate degree. Now, here's where it gets really interesting to me. The transfer with no award, it's not that big of a difference. Transfer, it's not that much different. And Katie and I went through this yesterday, and it kind of solidified for us how much mobility we have in Michigan when it comes to community college students transferring to other institutions. And I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for that, like economically and geographically, but when we're looking at those outcomes, it kind of, there's really not a measurable difference. I mean, it's measurable, of course, but it's not, I like to say it's probably statistically significant, but not practically significant. We don't see a whole lot of difference between if students transfer or not. Prior to being in Michigan, I lived in Utah, and you know, there were not many options of places for students to transfer. There's only 10 or 12 institutions of higher education there. And so there wasn't a lot of opportunity. We see here that kind of, you know, we're not seeing a lot of difference in terms of students transferring. However, let's move over to the last column, and we do see a big difference. So we see that 53% of students who didn't earn 6 credits in the first term left with less than 30 credit hours. So over half of the students, if they didn't earn 6 credits in the first term, half of them left with less than 30 credit hours. Yet, if you can get a student to earn 6 credits in the first term, only 20% of them left with less than 30 credits. To me, that's very significant. I have been somewhat, you know, there's the 15 to finish initiative where they want students to enroll in 15 credit hours each term, which, you know, I think is great because obviously doing the math, you get your associate degree in 2 years. But, you know, our students have complicated lives. And so enrolling in 15 credit hours may not be realistic for a lot of our students. But I thought that the 6 credit hours, I think that lower threshold, I think is really interesting. And so I just thought that that was very helpful for us to look at here as well. And then I also want to look at one of the metrics that looks at earning 24 credit hours in the first year. So we did 6 credits in the first term, and then I selected to look at earning 24 credits in the first year. VFA gives students a full year to get this done. It's not just 2 semesters, so it's not 12 and 12 necessarily. It could be 12, 9, and 3, because they can use that, you know, if you will, summer term to be able to get those 24 credit hours. But we see some pretty big gaps here as well. 25% of students who earned 24 credits in the first year transferred after they earned their associate degree. So we can see a lot of those students who transferred are after their associate degree were those students who they had that momentum in that first year. They got 24 credit hours done. But we also see that a very small percentage of our overall students ever even earn 24 credits. So only about 7,000 of our 48,000 students earn 24 credits in the first year. But if you did, 1 in 4 transferred after an associate degree. Then again, very consistently, what we're seeing in our data is that we don't see a big gap here. Students, there's definitely opportunities for mobility. So we don't see a whole lot of difference among those students who transfer with no award. But going over here to our last column, we see a huge gap in the number of students who left with less than 30 credit hours. So in some ways, because the outcome is the accumulation of credit, yet the disaggregation is, or the metric that we're looking at is also the accumulation of credit. I understand that clearly students who earn 24 credits in the first year are very unlikely to leave with less than 30 credit hours, because we're only looking at students who earn 24 credits. But we see again here that among the students who did not earn 24 credit hours in the first term, 43% of them left with less than 30 credit hours as well. So Katie, I'll pause here for a second and see if you have any thoughts about some of these credit accumulation questions.
No, it'll probably be repetitive of what I had been saying before, that I just think it's very difficult to track when we don't have clear ideas of what students' goals are. I put a few things in the chat that relate this data to the national data that's shared by the National Student Clearinghouse. The cohorts are different, so you're going to see different numbers, but what I love about the NSC data is that it compares it to all of the states and then nationally as well. And you can see that in the NSC report. Our transfer out rate is clearly much higher than anyone else in the nation, and that is corroborated in the data that Erica is sharing. But the bad news is that our students are not completing either an associate or a bachelor's degree, which again is what you're seeing and hearing in this VFA data as well. I don't know what the magic bullet is as far as how many credits people need to earn. I can tell you the work we've done with my transfer, one of our ultimate goals was both to increase baccalaureate completions, but also to increase associate degree completions, because we know so many students get stuck on that road and they end up with lots of credits, lots of debt, no degree. And if we can, and you know, it's terrible messaging to say, get that associate degree just in case, but my God, they need to get that associate degree just in case. And other efforts across the country, including in California, where they evaluated similar associate degree transfer work, have shown a marked increase in associate degrees in the disciplines where those pathways had been created. So we're very hopeful in Michigan now that those new pathways have been rolled out, that we will see some of that. But it's hard to differentiate between those cherry pickers like me who knew. I knew exactly which 4 courses I was going to take at my community college as opposed to my university. And I'm feeling terrible now that I'm still a non-completion for that community college, even though I'm on my way to a PhD. So it's too bad they can't get some of that credit.
So we're running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to skip our poll question. But I think, Katie, that's a good transition to like what has changed over time. And I want to share a couple of other resources with you as well. So what has changed over time? We have 3 cohorts we can look at. Enough time has passed for us to look at students who enrolled in the fall of 2011, 2012, and 2013. Unfortunately, we still do need to give students 6 years. And 6 years needs to pass. So very soon we should have access to students who started in the fall of 2014. But we see that things have stayed pretty consistent. Interestingly, fewer students have transferred between 2011 and 2013. And that's fairly consistent with what we see during this time period, post-recession. When in the fall of 2013, we were still serving many recession students who were attending a community college, but had always intended to enroll at a university. So it's possible that we're seeing a decline here among students who transferred with no award, because these 53,948 students were some of those students who were kind of, I would maybe describe them as recession students. So they attended a community college. They had always intended to go to a university, but for financial or other reasons chose to go to a community college. So this is pretty consistent with what we see in other data sets as well. But you know, I'm very anxious to start getting more data about this, especially because many of you know Michigan implemented the updated Michigan Transfer Agreement in fall of 2014, and we've been pretty consistently doing some transfer work over the last 5 or 6 years. So I'm excited to see what impact that has on our data as well. So when we came up with this webinar series, you know, we knew that the VFA data would be very helpful in some of the work that you're doing. But when it comes to transfer, we wanted to point out a couple of other resources that I think would be very helpful to you as well. On our website, there is a report that we received a grant working with Jason Taylor, who's a faculty member at the University of Utah. And what he did is it's a great report. It is long. And Jason looked at a cohort of university graduates, so students who graduated from universities in Michigan, and then he looked backwards. So instead of looking at a cohort of students that started at a community college and then tracking them, what Jason did is looked at a cohort of students who graduated from university and then looked backwards, which I think is an interesting perspective on some of this transfer work. There's a couple things in this report. For those of you who kind of geek out on data, there's a couple things I'll point out to you. One is Jason documented enrollment patterns by semester, kind of by year. So did students enroll, if it took a student 6 years to graduate, what was their pattern of enrollment? So did they go 2-2-2-2-4-4? Or did they go 4-4-2-2-4-4-4-4? So he was able to kind of show what those patterns were. That's a really popular part of this report. And then the other thing he did is he used something called a Sankey diagram, which is when that diagram where you have the community colleges documented or listed on the left-hand side, and it's showing us where the students transferred. So they went from one community college to another community college. And one thing that we see in Michigan that's it's unique, or we're kind of further along on the spectrum, our students go everywhere. Most of our institutions have a primary transfer partner, but many of our institutions have students go to all 15 public universities and over 10 independent colleges every single year. And I think part of that is I live in Grand Rapids, and you know, Grand Valley State University is in downtown Grand Rapids, but so is Western Michigan University. Ferris State has a campus in downtown Grand Rapids. So Michigan, you know, our decentralized state level infrastructure allows universities to kind of set up a campus anywhere. And that's fairly unique in Michigan. So those are two things in that report that I think are very helpful. The other thing that I always like to emphasize is that doing student level data analysis is not the only data analysis option that we have. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been involved in the Michigan Transfer Network, in the new Michigan Transfer Network, which was launched in May of 2019. And I just have a screenshot here of the front page of the Michigan Transfer Network, but colleges have the option of logging in and having secure access to some back-end tools that may be helpful to you. And in those back-end tools, you can do some analysis of course level data. And I think that's an underutilized data source for community colleges, because hundreds of students take your courses at your institution. So doing a course level analysis of student data is super challenging. But doing a course level analysis, and you kind of know how many of your students take an English course. And if it doesn't transfer anywhere, that's a problem, because it's impacting all of the students that took that course. And that's, I think, another way to look at that data when you're thinking about some of the transfer work you can do at your your institution. We're running out of time, but Kathy asked another very good question. If we can disaggregate outcomes based on if a student passed college level math or English. And yes, we can. That data is easily available, just like I've presented it in all these other areas. We could also look at these data based on students who did or did not pass college level English, college level math, or college level English and math. So definitely talk to your IR office about that, because those data are very accessible. So next steps, we encourage people to access the data from your college. It has been recommended by my colleagues in IR to make sure that you're clear about what you're asking for. So there are two different reports. One is focused on the KPI data, those early outcomes, those 1-year outcomes, and then the other report is those 6-year outcomes. So you may want to clarify what that is. But I've also invited all of our colleagues in IR to these webinars as well. So they should be fairly aware that this is going on. And we just kind of outlined several considerations for next steps, and it just kind of walks you through the process to use, beginning with accessing the data, and then really bringing more people into the conversation about what you might do. Us, the staff at the center, are always here to help you out if you have any questions. We would love to share resources that we have. I'm sure you do as well, but you all have a college to run and classes to teach and students to advise. And so we may run across some other reports that just didn't get on your radar. And so please reach out to us. And we also may have access to some data or be able to connect you with some other data sources that may be helpful to you as well. There's a couple other webinars that we are doing focused on the Michigan Transfer Network. So if you're interested in that course level data, you can go out to the MCCA website under events and register for these. There are 2 sessions that we're doing at Macro. I don't think Macro opened registration yet, but they will. And I believe for Macro members, their conference is going to be free this year, although I could be wrong because I don't think they've opened registration yet, but we're doing a couple of sessions there as well. So look for that information, and we'd love to see you at any of those webinars. Here is our contact information, and there were a few references that we made throughout the presentation. So we wanted to make sure that you had those. And I've gone 4 minutes over my time. And so I want to thank you all for joining us, and please reach out to us if you have any other questions. Thank you.